Tehran, the heart of Iran, a city once full of movement, voices, and colors, wakes up to a silence that feels unnatural. A silence that spreads through empty streets, closed shops, abandoned vehicles, and neighborhoods that once held millions. The air is thick, hot, and dry, a kind of dryness that doesn't just touch the skin, it burns through it. For months, Iran's water crisis had been deepening, but the warnings were ignored, dismissed, or pushed into political shadows. Today, those shadows have collapsed, revealing a truth too large and too dangerous to hide. Tehran has reached what authorities and crisis analysts feared the most: zero day. A moment when water stops, supply lines break, and more than 10 million people suddenly find themselves without the very element that keeps life possible. Inside the city, the panic didn't begin with noise. It began quietly the day people opened their taps and nothing came out. At first, there was confusion, then there was fear, and finally there was chaos. As the heat rose and water reserves ran out, Tehran began to unravel. Families rushed to supermarkets, only to find empty shelves. Long lines began forming in front of water tankers parked across different districts, but there was never enough. Elderly people fainted in lines, children cried for hours, and the tension among citizens began rising like wildfire. It didn't take long for fights to break out, for people to push, shove, and scream as they tried to keep their families alive. In government buildings, alarms were ringing as officials scrambled to set up emergency evacuation zones. The city's infrastructure was never prepared for a failure this large. Reports indicated groundwater depletion had reached catastrophic levels, and the few remaining reservoirs were nearly dry. But the true shock came from the satellite images. Massive lakes that once fed the region were now nothing more than cracked land. The rivers flowing toward Tehran had shrunk to narrow lines of muddy water. This day couldn't be avoided anymore. Across the region, countries watched Tehran's collapse with fear, because a crisis of this scale isn't just a local event, it becomes a chain reaction. Millions without water means millions potentially on the move, desperate, frightened, and trying to escape a dying city. The Iranian government began organizing emergency zones outside Tehran, but even those were overwhelmed quickly. The scorching heat, rising above 40 degrees during the day, made the situation unbearable. Hospitals filled with people suffering from dehydration. Pharmacies ran out of basic medical supplies, and through it all, people kept asking the same question: how did this happen? How did a powerful capital reach a point where it could no longer provide water to its own people? Behind the scenes, global analysts were quick to connect the dots. Iran's internal crisis had now become Putin's worst fear. For years, Russia had relied heavily on Iran for strategic partnerships, militarily, economically, and politically. Iran's stability was essential for Russia's regional influence. A destabilized Iran meant a weaker alliance, vulnerable borders, and unpredictable political shifts. As Tehran fell into crisis, Russia watched with anxiety. Moscow understood one thing clearly: if Iran collapses internally, the geopolitical map of the Middle East would be rewritten, and not in their favor. Footage began circulating online showing masses of people walking out of Tehran on foot, carrying bags, bottles, and whatever little water they had left. Parents tried to comfort their children under the harsh sun. Elderly people leaned on others for support. Volunteers distributed what little supplies they could find. But nothing could hide the truth. Tehran, one of the largest cities in the world, was on the edge of abandonment. Inside the city, homes became ovens. Without water, without cooling, and without functioning infrastructure, life became impossible. In many neighborhoods, electricity began to fail as the grid overloaded. Communications became unstable. Internet speeds dropped, and in some places, connections went completely down. Panic grew as people realized they were being cut off from the outside world. In desperation, some residents began breaking into closed stores, searching for bottled water. Others smashed old water tanks, only to find them nearly empty. Authorities called for calm, but their voices were drowned beneath the noise of a collapsing society. The lines for water tankers stretched for kilometers. People began wading through the night, sleeping on the streets, hoping morning would bring fresh supply. But morning only brought disappointment. Tankers arrived half full or didn't arrive at all. The country's internal distribution network was failing. Water pipelines had cracked under pressure, pumps had run dry, and the wells supplying the city were now empty caves of dust. International organizations warned that this could become the largest urban water crisis in modern history. Countries nearby offered assistance, but organizing relief for 10 million people was nearly impossible. Logistics broke down, coordination was chaotic. Even the army struggled to maintain order as frustration turned into anger. Small protests erupted, demanding answers from authorities, but Tehran was too big, too crowded, and too thirsty to manage peacefully. As the crisis deepened, new fears emerged. Health experts warned of disease outbreaks. With no water, sanitation collapsed. Garbage piled up, sewage systems malfunctioned, the heat accelerated the spread of bacteria. Hospitals began reporting rising cases of infections and heat strokes. Many doctors said they were working without rest, using minimal resources, improvising methods to cool patients down. They knew that without water, survival chances were slim. At night, the city didn't rest. Loudspeakers from emergency vehicles echoed through the streets, instructing people to move toward designated evacuation centers. Families packed whatever belongings they could carry. Some left their homes forever. Others hesitated, unsure of where they would go. For many, Tehran wasn't just a city, it was identity, livelihood, memories. Leaving meant losing everything. Outside Tehran, highways became rivers of vehicles. Traffic jams stretched for hours. Tempers flared. Cars overheated. Many people abandoned their vehicles and continued on foot. Police and military units tried to maintain order, but the volume of evacuees was simply too large. Every road out of the city looked the same. Exhausted faces, dusty clothes, and people holding empty bottles that once gave them hope. Meanwhile, global news channels broadcasted constant updates. Analysts compared Tehran's zero DUI to historic disasters. But this wasn't the result of war or an earthquake. It was a disaster long predicted, but never prevented. A slow, burning crisis that suddenly erupted like an explosion. Experts warned other major cities around the world to learn from Tehran. Water scarcity was no longer a distant threat. It was a real, immediate danger. Inside Iran's government, emergency meetings ran non-stop. Officials tried to negotiate water shipments from neighboring countries. They pushed for fast construction of temporary desalination plants. They considered drastic emergency measures like rationing water through military control. But every solution required time, and Tehran had run out of time. One of the most chilling scenes came from drones flying over the city at night. The once bright streets were dim. Many districts were completely dark. Neighborhoods known for their vibrant energy appeared lifeless. The drone cameras captured long lines of people walking, lit only by phone lights or small lamps. It looked like a city in exodus. International reactions grew intense. Russia, deeply concerned, began emergency discussions with Iranian officials. Putin understood that a destabilized Iran could weaken Russia's position in the Middle East and open doors for rival influences. Tehran was not just a city, it was a pillar of regional power, and watching that pillar collapse shook Moscow more than anything else. In Tehran's outskirts, large camps began filling with evacuees. Tents spread across dry fields. Water tankers lined up outside these camps, but the distribution was slow. Families waited under the scorching sun. Aid workers struggled to keep up. The number of refugees kept rising each hour. What started as a water crisis was now turning into a humanitarian disaster. A young father in one of the camps described the moment he realized he had to leave. He had returned home after waiting 6 hours in a water line carrying only half a bottle. His children were crying from thirst. His wife was dizzy. He tried to calm them, but he knew they couldn't survive another day. So he took the hardest decision of his life. He left his home, not knowing if he would ever return. His story mirrored thousands of others. Footage from Tehran's once busy bazaars showed shops shuttered, stalls empty, and vendors gone. The smell of spices and fresh food that once defined the market was replaced by the smell of humidity, sweat, and dust. Tourists who visited these markets remembered the colors, the noise, the movement. Now all that remained was silence, broken occasionally by a distant cry or a police siren. As the days passed, desperation began turning into anger. People demanded accountability. They wanted answers. They wanted solutions that should have come years earlier, but the authorities had none. They were overwhelmed, struggling to manage the scale of devastation. The government began asking international partners for immediate help, but global agencies warned that the logistics required were enormous and time was limited. On social media, videos went viral showing families sharing one small bottle of water among 5 or 6 people. Children cried from thirst, asking their parents why there was no water. Elderly people collapsed in the heat. Volunteers tried to help, but resources were too scarce. In many neighborhoods, people formed community groups to collect any remaining water from storage tanks or wells. But those efforts could not sustain millions. The situation worsened when news broke that several treatment plants had completely shut down due to lack of water input. Without treatment, even the minimal remaining supply became unsafe. Experts warned people not to drink contaminated water, but many did anyway. Survival left them no choice. Meanwhile, international pressure increased. Countries debated sending massive emergency aid. Some offered aircraft loaded with bottled water and medical supplies. But even that raised new questions. How do you distribute water to 10 million people in a collapsing city? How do you prevent riots at distribution points? How do you stop disease outbreaks in overcrowded camps? Despite everything, there were moments of humanity. Young volunteers formed groups to bring water to elderly residents who couldn't travel. Medical students helped in clinics without pay. Ordinary people shared whatever they had: a cup of water, a piece of fruit, shade, or words of comfort. Through the suffering, unity appeared like a fragile but powerful light, yet the crisis was far from over. Experts warned that restoring full water supply to Tehran could take months. Evacuation efforts continued. People held on to hope, but uncertainty weighed heavily on every mind. They didn't know when they could return. They didn't know if their city would ever be the same, and through all of this, one message became clear. The crisis in Tehran was not just a local tragedy. It was a warning to the world, a reminder that water, the simplest and most essential resource, could become the source of the greatest global instability. Cities everywhere began reevaluating their water strategies. Governments ordered emergency surveys. Scientists urged urgent action. And people everywhere began asking the same question: if it could happen to Tehran, could it happen to us? As Tehran struggled through zero DOI, the world watched a city fight for survival. A city that once thrived became a symbol of vulnerability. A city that once stood strong now showed how fragile human civilization can be without water. And with Iran's internal crisis shaking the region, Putin's worst fear had finally come true. A geopolitical earthquake triggered not by war, but by the absence of water. The story of Tehran's zero DY became more than a news headline. It became a message, a desperate call for change, for preparation, for awareness. Because the lesson was clear: no nation, no city, no power is safe when water disappears.